So this is again another short revision presentation on minimum and maximum prices as a form of government intervention to correct market failure. And in this short clip, I will look at minimum prices first of all, with a particular reference to the national minimum wage as a form of a minimum price in a labour market. And then we'll move on then to looking at maximum prices within the same clip. So minimum prices in a market. By definition, a minimum price is a price floor. For a market, suppliers cannot sell the product legally at a lower price. So as a form of government intervention, it is set above the free market equilibrium price. The government does not like the rate set at the free market equilibrium price. They believe the price is too low. Now, it's too low in a way that it doesn't protect the supplier in some cases, depending upon the nature of the good, and or in some cases it could be that the equilibrium price is too low and governments want to make the product more expensive, again similar to taxation, to try and discourage people from consuming the good. Minimum prices are slightly different because it very much so depends upon the nature of the good. It could be a case where the minimum price is imposed to protect the producer of that good from exploitation, or it could be introduced to protect the consumer of the good from being exploited by firms, or the governments may wish the consumer to pay a higher price because of the negative externalities associated with that good. But minimum price by law, no supplier can sell a product at any lower price. A minimum price is a form of government intervention in a market in order to correct market failure. To be effective, the minimum price must be set above the normal free market equilibrium. So governments will look at the normal free market equilibrium and they will set a price which is certainly higher than the equilibrium set in the free market. If it is below, then it simply will have no impact. It does the opposite effect. In some cases, a minimum price takes the form of a guaranteed minimum price at which the government or a purchasing agency will buy the product for a farmer, for example. So there have been examples in the past of where firms have exploited milk production. And the governments have stepped in and said, whatever happens in that market, we will ensure that every farmer gets an absolute minimum of 18 pence per litre of milk that they produce. So regardless of what the market was demanding, and regardless of the workings of the free market, the government intervened and said, no matter what way the market goes, we will ensure that every farmer gets an absolute minimum of 18 pence per litre. Examples including price support schemes in the EU. China has recently offered a generous minimum price support program for their cotton farmers. Under the scheme, the government purchased cotton from farmers at a set price, building up a massive stockpile. So governments can intervene in markets using these minimum prices in different ways. In this case, it was to protect the livelihoods and the businesses of the cotton farmers, but also to build stockpiles of cotton in terms of speculation, possibly for the future. Where we see minimum prices in the UK as an example of goods that certainly governments would want to reduce the consumption of, we can look at alcohol as a really good example. So concerns about alcohol-fueled violence and the public health problems associated with excessive drinking have fueled the debate over alcohol prices. Now, what we have seen over the years is the negative externalities associated with excessive drinking. We see that there are some individuals that don't drink heavy, but they could be in the company of somebody that does, and therefore they're exposed to being possibly a victim of alcohol-fueled violence. And of course, the cost of policing that to make sure that's reduced. Again, think about the cost of policing at nighttime, during the nighttime economy, when the pubs, bars, and clubs, etc., are all open. That creates a greater strain on policing, a greater strain then on the NHS to try and cure any of those issues that do arise from that. In 2013, the UK coalition government abandoned plans to introduce a minimum unit price for alcohol of 45 pence per unit. So there was talk in 2013 of introducing that absolute minimum price of 45 pence per unit, and that was designed to try and reduce the sale of cheap alcohol. Since 2014, there has been a ban on the sale of alcohol below cost price, defined as a level of alcohol duty plus VAT. A can of average strength lager cannot be sold for less than 40 pence. So the minimum price on lager is 40 pence. Any firm that sells a lager for anything less than 40 pence would be breaking the law. A standard bottle of vodka cannot be sold for less than £8.89. Again, any firm that sells to the customer at £8.80, less than £8.89 will be breaking the law. Non-compliance with the ban can result of up to 6 months imprisonment and or a £20,000 fine. What normally would happen there would be that the firm would be, if they're caught first, they'll be charged or they'll be fined £20,000 or up to £20,000. If they continue to commit this offence, then they could spend 6 months then in prison in addition to another fine. Arguments then for the minimum price. Why should we put this restriction on it? Again, think of the externalities. It reduces some externalities from preloading of alcohol at home. So again, if we make alcohol cheap to be bought in off license or in the shop, it may increase the number of people who are drinking alcohol at home. Pubs may benefit from higher minimum prices in supermarkets. We can target cheaper, high-strength drinks used by younger drinkers. So it's not a minimum price on all alcohol. You can put it a greater minimum price on certain types of alcohol, particularly those of a greater strength and those that will be more popular amongst young drinkers. Arguments against the minimum price. Again, minimum price is a tax on responsible drinkers. It's inequitable. So there are, I'm sure you'll be well aware that there are some people who do go out and overconsume alcohol and disgrace themselves. But there will be people who consider themselves to be responsible drinkers, i.e. they don't over drink, they drink reasonable amounts within the reasonable limits and have less impact on their health than what excessive drinkers would. However, the minimum price applies to everyone. And so therefore some may argue that it's almost like taxing those who do drink responsibly. Producers can agree voluntary policies on alcohol price or strength. Again, if producers are involved, that could possibly try and diminish the effectiveness of that minimum price. Better to raise alcohol duties, which will raise extra tax revenue. So the minimum price does not gain the government any revenue. Tax is the only policy that will gain revenue for the government. The firm doesn't see an increase in revenue from minimum prices. It simply just reduces consumption. If we look here, again, some interesting data, only 1 in 50 young British adults drink frequently. So we look at 2005, 7% of young British adults would have considered to have been drinkers. And if you look, frequent drinking equates to drinking on 5 or more days in the week before interview. Okay, so if you were a frequent drinker, you're drinking 5 or more times during the week. Whereas in 2013, it went from, again, from 7% in 2005 down to 2% in 2013. So we are seeing that there are being gradual changes in behaviour of how much individuals do drink in the UK. I'm going to switch over now to my diagram. So again, I'm going to draw the diagram for a minimum price. What I want to do here, though, is apply this to the national minimum wage, because the national minimum wage is a form of a minimum price in the labour market, the wage rate being the price for labour. So on the y-axis, I'm going to title that as wage rate, 0 in the corner, and quantity of labour on the x-axis. Okay. So I'm going to start off with my downward sloping demand for labour curve. Now, this is the same diagram as it would be for a product market. The only difference is I'm applying this now to the labour market. Upward sloping supply, which is SL, and then dashed lines then for our equilibrium, and that will be Q1 and W1. Now, on this diagram, a minimum price is imposed, wage rate at W1 and a level of employment at Q1, a quantity of labour employed at Q1 is, in the government's eyes, too low. The wage rate is too low now. It's too low to allow individuals to live a full and healthy life. It's not enough for individuals to live respectably or decently within today's society. The government believe that to be too low of a wage rate. So left to the free market, individuals could get paid low wages, and that stems to things like you've got issues with the working poor, for example, where individuals are going out working 9 to 5 shifts, Monday to Friday, full-time jobs, but they're not getting the wage rate that's high enough in order for them to actually live a decent standard of living in the eyes of other people. And so the government see that even though they're working, the wage rate is too low. So governments intervene and they say to firms, you can pay wage rate W1, you must by law pay your staff the national minimum wage, which is set above the equilibrium or the free market equilibrium. So I'm going to call that W2 and then tag that as minimum wage. So you can see here, it's set above the free market equilibrium wage rate. So it's a higher wage rate from W1 to W2. Now, a few things to point out here. What this does that we don't particularly like is that it takes a market that was once in equilibrium and it pushes it into disequilibrium. So automatically, the imposition of the national minimum wage will distort the market. It pushes the market out of equilibrium and into disequilibrium. And what I'm going to do here to show that the effects of disequilibrium, I'm going to do an A and a B. And as you can see here, I've got a situation in which more labor is being supplied than what firms are demanding. So I'm going to finish off my diagram and then I'm going to explain it now in a second. So I'm going to call that Q2 and Q3. So there's a lot of movements going on here. So I'll start off first of all. The increase in the national minimum wage, if I look at the supply of labor, which comes from households. Households supply their labor. You and I supply your labor. I supply my labor to the school. As a school teacher, they reward me with supplying my labor through a wage. So what I've got here is I've got this extension along the supply curve. The increase in the wage rate has incentivized workers to supply more of their labor. So the quantity of labor supplied increases from Q1 up to Q3. More people, more individuals, more households, or rather more individuals within households are now more willing and able to supply their labor because the wage rate of W2 is a much greater financial or monetary incentive to want to work. Many of us are motivated to work because of the wage rates that we receive from supplying our labor. The flip side of that, though, is that that's for the individual. Let's look now at the objectives of the firm. So firms are the economic agents which demand labor. Firms employ labor, labor being a factor of production. As a result of the wage increase, by law, the firm must pay that higher wage. Wage is a reward for labor, yes, but it's also a cost of the factor that is labor as a factor of production. It now costs the firm more to employ staff. So the increase in the national minimum wage creates actually a contraction along that demand curve because firms look now to reduce the quantity demanded of workers because it's now more expensive. They might look to move to more capital intensive methods of machinery, for example, to try and replace individuals because the wage rate is too high with capital machinery. So we've got two opposite ends of the spectrum here. We've got more individuals wanting to work, but firms now want to demand less labor. So we have pushed the market into disequilibrium. Now what we've got here between A and B is we've got excess supply of labor. Now if this was a product market, it would be excess supply of the product. More of the product is being supplied than what consumers actually demand because from a consumer point of view, the price is increased, therefore they're less willing and able to purchase that good. In relation to the labor market, wages increase, more people want to work, but firms are demanding less employees. So the issue here is that we've got excess supply of labor, also known as a surplus of labor, but from Q1 to Q2, we have unemployment. Firms now are seeking to create unemployment. They make people redundant. So the staff that would have been employed between Q1 and Q2 have now lost their jobs because it's too expensive to employ them. Q3 were never employed in the first place, and therefore you can't make somebody who was never employed unemployed. So the good thing about the national minimum wage is for these workers here at Q2, the workers that have managed to keep their job, but also keep the job whilst also earning wage rate W2. So they're happy out, so to speak. They've kept their job and they're earning a higher wage. They are the winners. The losers are the individuals between Q1 and Q2 who have lost their jobs. So yes, the wage rate increased, but they didn't get the benefit from that wage increase because the firm made them redundant. And remember that redundancy is different from sacking an individual. If you're made redundant through no fault of your own, the firm simply no longer requires your services, and it does not make rational sense to continue to employ you. The dangers with unemployment is, think about this very carefully. This is a form of government intervention. The unintended consequence of a minimum wage is that it creates unemployment. And unemployment goes against the government macroeconomic objective of making sure that unemployment is low. So you could argue that the national minimum wage leads to, in a perfectly competitive labour market, it leads to government failure, because this policy has led to a worsening of the situation. This policy has been introduced and it has resulted in individuals losing their jobs. So back again to my presentation. Some examples then of, or looking at evaluating the national minimum wage. The case for a higher level of minimum wage in the UK, we're looking at equity justification. Every job should be given fair pay linked with skills, experience of an employee. It's important that staff are paid on a fair wage, that nobody should be exploited. Remember, firms are at danger of exploiting their individuals by paying them a low wage. Poverty reduction. Obviously, if this low wage set by the free market is leading to poverty, then the government have a duty to try and stop that. A minimum wage boosts the take-home pay for thousands of low-paid workers. They're getting an extra additional few pounds onto their every hour that they work, and that will increase their take-home pay at the end of every week and at the end of every month. Training. It encourages firms to upskill their workers and can lead to higher labour productivity. So the increase in wage can act as an incentive, which links to the next point. It will improve incentives for people to look for paid work. So it'll improve the incentive to want to enter into a labour market. But for those that are currently in it, for those that currently get to keep their jobs on an increase in the national minimum wage, they may be more incentivized to work harder. They may be more incentivized to take up training opportunities to try and gain even more pay. Anti-discrimination, always something that's fantastic in the labour markets. We should not, in today's society, ever have to face discrimination in any way, shape or form in the workplace. We should never have had to have faced it in the first place, but we certainly, in this day and age, should not have to face discrimination. It's a way of tackling discrimination of low-paid female, and particularly for young workers as well. Yes, young workers are not as highly skilled as more experienced adults because they're not exposed to the workplace as long, but that doesn't mean that they have the right to be exploited. Arguments then against the national minimum wage, obviously the job losses, which we just talked about. Higher minimum wage adds to the cost of employing workers and might cause higher unemployment. Unemployment goes against the government macroeconomic objective. Small businesses, businesses may struggle to make a profit. There's a risk of a rise in business closures. So if the wage rate increases, firms are struggling to cover their costs. It could lead to bankruptcy in the most extreme case. It may lead to them having to again engage in more austerity over the management of their finances. We also then have training in there as well. So there are better incentives for training than a minimum wage. For example, tax relief on apprenticeships. Competitiveness might take many UK businesses less competitive, or might make them less competitive in global markets. In relation to then inflation, higher labour costs might cause higher inflation, which then lowers real incomes. So if the cost is rising to employ, but if incomes start to rise, remember that can boost AD, but depending upon the position of which the economy is in, an increase in AD may lead or may bring with it an increase in inflationary pressure, which in real terms would mean that individuals are not really any better off than what they would have been before. Their wage rate now is just slightly closer in line with the rate of inflation. So having looked at minimum prices, we'll move on now to looking at maximum prices. So the government or an industry regulator can set a maximum price to prevent the market price from rising above a certain level. So one main aim of this might be to prevent the monopolistic exploitation of consumers. So again, we don't want consumers to be exploited by too high of a price that's set by the free market. To be effective, a maximum price has to be set below the free market price. So this has to be set below what would have been the free market price set in a market that is free from government intervention. One example might be when a shortage of foodstuffs threatens large rises in the free market price. So food is a necessity. Governments must step in to make sure that the free market doesn't push individuals out. Everyone needs to have access to the basic needs in order to live a full and healthy life. Other examples include rent controls, always a very popular example on properties. For example, the system of rent controls in Manhattan and in the United States. Price capping also happens when the competition authorities judge that customers are being exploited by businesses using their monopoly power. Monopoly power, by definition, is the ability to set prices, and firms exploit that ability to set prices due to the lack of competition in the industry. For example, the EU has introduced price caps for roaming charges on consumers made by mobile phone services providers. So there's evidence there that as that market becomes more concentrated within the hands of a few large firms, that there's risks that they could exploit individuals. A maximum price seeks to control the price, but also involves a normative judgment on behalf of the government about what the price should be. So it's very much so based upon what the government believed to be the right price. But as you and I know at this stage, what one person believes to be the right price may be seen as something slightly different in the eyes of another individual. So if I move over now to my diagram, I'm just going to share my screen with you now. So I'm going to switch over now to the back of my sheet of paper. Okay, and again, you can follow this through with me. So just now to the diagram. On the y-axis, you've got price, 0 in the corner, and quantity then on the x-axis. We start off, as always, with our standard downward sloping demand curve. Now this is for a product market, not for a labor market. So I'm just using standard supply and demand. Upward sloping supply curve. And then we have our dashed line of, or showing us our original equilibrium, our equilibrium set in the free market. So P1 and Q1, S1 and D1. Okay, so governments have a look at this. This is the price set by the free market. Price level P1 in the government's eyes is simply too high, and they want to introduce a maximum price. I'm getting confused now. A maximum price that is below P1. They want to push that price below P1. P1 is too expensive, and so they set a law that no firm is allowed to sell above the new maximum price of P2, which is max price. So the free market equilibrium is set at P1. Governments think that is too high, so that's our original equilibrium. Again, just like with a minimum price, it pushes the market into disequilibrium. So I've got an A, B, and a C. So initially, if we look at the lowering of the price, first of all, from the consumer's point of view, from A to C, we experience this extension in the demand curve. More consumers are willing and able to purchase the good because it is now cheaper. It once was a price level P1, it's now cheaper at P2. Now, no firm legally can sell any price above P2. They can sell any price below P2 if they wish to go anywhere below that, but they cannot sell at a price between P1 and P2, or certainly they can't sell anywhere above P1. This is now the legal limit at which they're allowed to set the highest possible price of that good. Going above that would be illegal, and firms obviously can be sanctioned through fines and imprisonment in some of the most extreme cases. So consumers now demand more of their goods. So the demand for the good increases up to Q2, okay, which is great. More people now are willing and able to want to purchase the good because the price is now within reasonable, financially is now a more reasonable figure for them. However, again, the flip side of this is we now need to look at the other economic agent, which in this case is the supplier, the firm. They experience a contraction in the supply of the good. And the reason for that is because the good now is no longer as profitable to produce as what it would have been if the price was still at P1. The firm cannot sell any higher than P2. So therefore, they have to look at their costings. They have to look at how much they can produce and how much they can sell that good for to make sure that they meet those government guidelines. So think if you look at like rent control. The rent in London, for example, could be at price level P1 per month. That's far too high. Individuals cannot rent property, and landlords are exploiting the free market. And as a result, governments intervene and say, well, in certain areas, for certain individuals, you cannot charge them rent any higher than P2. That is the standalone, that is the legal limit that you can charge your tenants to rent that property. So they experience a contraction in the supply of the good from point A to point B, again, creating this excess demand. Or otherwise known as a shortage. So excess demand, otherwise known as a shortage, from Q3 to Q2. The firm is not only producing Q2 units of the good, but the market is demanding Q2 units of the good. And that's a significant shortage you can see on that diagram as a result of those actions. Okay, so minimum price is set above the free market equilibrium, whereas a maximum price is set below the free market equilibrium. Both are legal limits of which a firm must comply with. And before we finish off, I'm just going to quickly go over some examples of, well, what would happen if there wasn't a legal limit. So just to give you some examples of where a maximum price may take place. The government or an industry regulator can set a maximum price to prevent the market price from rising above a certain level. So rent controls to improve affordability. Remember that housing is a need. Housing is shelter. We need to be able to live in a house of some sort in order to live a full and healthy life. And if rental, for some people, for those that can't afford mortgages, if the rent is too high and if landlords are exploiting their tenants, then it may get to situations where individuals simply cannot afford to live in rented accommodation. They can't afford to purchase a house, but they also can't afford rented accommodation either. Energy price caps to control fuel bills. So we have situations in which the price of energy bills is rising quite significantly due to the fact that the market is very much so a monopoly. So the government realized that, look, we need energy. It's almost an inelastic good. And firms that produce the energy realize that there's little alternative. So they risk exploiting individuals, and governments must intervene through setting those price caps. Caps on CEO, chief executive officers' pay bonuses in the labour market. We read some extraordinary stories of where some individuals are paid almost up to nearly $500,000 for the companies that they lead, yet people that work within those companies are also paid national minimum wage. So you've got the working poor working alongside those that are on excessive pay and excessive bonuses, and that's not fair, some may believe. It's not an equitable view to have of society. Cap on mobile phone roaming charges, we talked about that earlier. Price capping for regional monopoly water companies. If we look at London, for example, we're under TfL. Sorry, not TfL, Thames Water. And so Thames Water may be at risk of exploiting the fact that when we turn on our taps, we know it's going to come from Thames Water anyway. Cap on interest rates charged by payday lenders, such as Wonga. So payday loans, avoid them if you can. But they, in some cases, up to nearly 100% interest. So you pay back double what you borrow. In some cases, they really do exploit the fact that some individuals need quick money. Cap on annual charges to occupational pension plans. So again, some people are in situations where whenever they do retire, they're going to have an excessive pension pot, whereas others would have a pension pot that is not fully sufficient. Currency pegs, for example, the Hong Kong and the US dollar. So you can also put caps on foreign exchange to prevent that quite distinct gap in currency rates between one and the other. So evaluating caps in different markets. So a maximum price also involves a normative judgment on behalf of the government about what that price should be. So the main argument of a maximum price is two things. One, it's very much so based on normative judgment. It's what the government believe to be the right rate at which to set the price at. It also distorts the market. It puts the market into disequilibrium. Is that something that you want? Do you want there to be a shortage? This policy actively creates excess demand. It actively creates a shortage in that market. A useful surrogate, benefits are, it's a useful surrogate for competition. It holds prices down, so therefore consumer welfare gains. So very much so the consumer benefits from this. It stops that excessive rising, firms gaining monopoly power, firms exploiting consumers through setting higher prices. Incentivizes for businesses to cut costs to maintain profits, and that in effect can fuel efficiencies. So if you know you have to sell your product at a cheaper price than what you would have done under the free market, you will look for rather creative ways to potentially become more creative in the market in terms of making sure that your business is efficient as it possibly can be. Downsides would be that it reduces profits, less money for capital investment. So firms, again, they can make redundancies, they can downscale their business. Governments can lose out on things like corporation tax if it does lower profits made by the business. It may dissuade new entrants. So if new entrants know that, look, no matter how hard I try, the government's going to control the prices I sell at, there's no point of entering into this industry. So you could put off new entrants coming in. New entrants always have a positive impact on individuals because it creates that ability to, in effect, create competition. Firms might raise prices in other ways. So they could possibly, if you look at, they have to pay a maximum price on certain goods, but for companies that produce a range of other goods, they may make up for the losses they make with one good by charging higher prices on other goods. Alternatives would be measures to reduce entry barriers in an industry. So rather than put a maximum price, rather than distort the market, why not look at deregulation, reducing the red tape, the rules and regulations that exist behind firms? Why not include ways to try and make it easier for new firms to enter the market and leave it to the disciplines of the free market? Allow there to be a natural shift outwards in supply due to the entrance of new firms supplying the good, which will therefore bring down the free market equilibrium price without creating a shortage. Higher taxes on monopoly profits. So if this is designed to stop firms from abusing their customers, why tarnish them all with the one brush? This policy affects all businesses in that industry, but many of them will play by the book. Many of them will not exploit their consumers. So why not use things like the Competition and Markets Authority to uproot any examples of where there are firms that are actively exploiting their consumers? Penalize the individual firms who break the rules rather than, in effect, sanction everybody within that market by being very controlling over that business. Something that can happen as a result of minimum maximum prices is the introduction of black markets, also known as a shadow market. So a black market or a shadow market is an illegal market in which the market price is higher than a legally imposed price ceiling. Black markets develop where there is excess demand. Some consumers are prepared to pay higher prices in black markets in order to get the goods and services they want. So this is illegal. Buying in the black market is illegal. Selling in the black market is also illegal. And what happens is that because there is a shortage, firms will know that consumers will be in high demand for this good. But some firms would be willing to break the law and to sell them at a higher price in order to make money from it. So they realize that there is a shortage and they profit from that shortage to get individuals to pay a higher price. With a shortage, Higher prices are a rationing device. So we ration them, or the product, we ration them through setting a higher price to only those that can afford the higher price. Good examples of black markets include tickets for major sporting events, rock concerts, and black markets for children's toys and designer products that are in scarce supply. So if you think about, if you book tickets to go and see a festival in the time before COVID-19, as the festival approaches, as it gets closer to the date, some people will try and sell their tickets in the second-hand market for significantly greater prices, knowing that all other tickets have been sold out, and literally it's a case of how can I sell them to somebody who's so desperate to want to go. There is also evidence of black markets in the illegal distribution and sale of computer software products, where pirated copies can often dwarf sales for legal produced software. And again, that's illegal, selling those goods which do not come under the right appropriate names. Lastly then, rationing where there is a market shortage. Rationing where there is a maximum price might also be achieved by allocating the good on a first come, first served basis. For example, queues of customers. If you're there and you're lined up first, you get first dibs at that good. Suppliers might also allocate the scarce goods by distributing only to preferred customers. So they might only say, for example, those of a certain age group, those of a certain characteristic, we have to ration down to only the elderly, for example, to only the young people. Both of those ways of rationing goods might be considered inequitable or unfair, because it is likely that eventually those who might have the greatest need for a commodity are likely to have their needs met. So it has to be done on a needs basis. Who really needs it and who should have access to it? But again, what individuals or certain groups of individuals think that some people should have more or less access to goods and services than some other individuals. Okay, it's very much so dependent upon the nature of the product and the nature of which the market is that you operate in. So again, I hope that that has been useful in helping get your head around minimum and maximum prices.